I think from my channel, you would be well within your rights to assume that I only ever play walking simulators, and subpar ones at that, but unfortunately that's not true. I'd say that on the whole, I actually barely touch them, but when I do, I find that they make for some of the most interesting conversations in gaming. See, walking simulators are not only good ways to make simple games out of stories, but they are ideal projects for companies with small budgets. Walking simulators are often first person, sometimes they don't even have a modelled player character so you can just see your little shoes if you look down, or your arms and hands using items and opening doors. They really, if ever, have an inventory system or any UI beyond a pause menu. They only need to account for simple animations such as opening and closing doors, outside of cutscenes that is, and mechanics are often brutally simple. Pulling levers, activating computer interfaces, clicking single buttons, calling lifts. It's rarely ever complex, and that's okay. Some of the most memorable experiences I've ever played have been walking simulators. Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and Soma have both made for incredible gaming discussions, and yet the relationship between this story and their gameplay could be, at best, described as a loveless marriage. I can't remember being able to physically interface with anything in Rapture. You would just press A at things and sometimes they would respond, and the gameplay loop focuses entirely on getting lost in small-town Shropshire, watching the dying memories of shrill old people. Soma's gameplay loop sees you walking down linear corridors and occasionally interacting with the only interactive button on a panel of buttons, whatever it took to continue the story. Those two games are brilliant, standing firmly on two compelling and quite unique stories, but god are they mechanically bare bones. Since gameplay is so often bare bones, since mechanics are at best minimal and at worst crude, and since the existence of side characters is commonly just reduced to being a voice on the other end of a walkie-talkie, it means that, I'd say, in most cases, these simulators are like 90% story, 10% gameplay. At best, 70% to 30%. But never more, because then they technically wouldn't be a walking simulator, I suppose. And neither would today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. If there's one thing that walking simulators lack, it's challenge, but if you fancy a bit of challenge while you're on the bus, waiting for those hot pockets to bake, or trapped at the bottom of a well, consider taking a running jump at Doom Tower. Doom Tower is the ultimate in mobile combat challenge. The Arbiter used it as a giant prison for all the bad guys she couldn't beat herself, but also didn't want to just leave to walk around and terrorize the locals. Warning, this is hard stuff. You will need an army of champions, and you will need them to account for as many different mechanics as you can, as some bosses can only be beaten in very specific ways. Just this month, Raid has released Awakening, a massive new feature for the game, and an insanely difficult new dungeon, the Iron Twins Fortress. Beating this fortress and the Iron Twins within allows you to awaken your characters and fundamentally change the way they fight to approach any new challenge. And now that Death Knight finally has his new superpowered legendary version, there has never been a better time to log in, since you get him for free just by logging in on any 7 days between now and October 27th to add him to your collection just in time for Halloween. What's more is that you can use promo code DKRises for a bunch of free items to instantly reach max level and 5-star ascend your strongest character. And this is available for new and existing players. If you've not started with Raid yet, click my link in the description or my QR code on screen right now for unique bonuses worth $30. You get a free epic champion called Tyrell, 200k silver, 1 energy refill, 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard. You can skip the grind and start summoning the best of the best as soon as you start the game. So, like I said, scan that QR code or smash that link in the description to get started with Raid today. And now, back to the video. This walking simulator template suits smaller businesses with less resources because it means that they have the means to create a solid, enjoyable, and memorable experience without needing to pour cash into building and maintaining huge development teams, go through endless iterations on perfecting and balancing intricate combat systems, and testing insanely difficult and convoluted puzzles like that one bridge in Resident Evil 4 that I didn't realise would just give you a QuickTime prompt when you got near it, so I spent upwards of an hour trying to figure out how to cross it. Just when it comes to walking simulators, there is a difficult balance to strike. Although this formula is designed for companies with limitations, it has limitations of its own. Namely, when a game is 90% story, a lot of that game's quality is going to ride entirely on the success of the story itself. If the story is bad, what does the game now have to offer beyond maybe some interesting graphics or 1 or 2 voice performances, since the cast of characters is often not only small but also completely physically absent. But honestly, there are a lot of games that have nice graphics and well-acted dialogue. So if these things are the only things that set a bad story apart, it's not going to set it apart for long. A bad story means that a walking simulator slips into obscurity just as soon as it arrived on scene. And a good story is, generally speaking, how a walking simulator reaches its maximum possible potential. But even a good story can become outdated. Before we begin, like the video and comment if you have your own thoughts on the burden of walking simulators. Which walking simulators do it best, which do it worse, and why, which are your favourites, and what do you think is the secret to making the perfect walking simulator? Subscribe to my channel now for more gaming discussion, and I have an exciting announcement to make. For patrons only, I will be beginning a 5-minute review series where I create 5-minute videos talking about all the games I can't quite stretch to a proper video but still want to talk about. My first 3 5-minute review videos will be on Hades, Cuphead, and indie darling Grease, or Gree, or whatever, and they are available to patrons of any tier. However, I will be creating a compilation video of all of them and posting it at the end of the year if you'd rather wait and get them for free all in one go here on YouTube. Furthermore, check out twitch.tv/MertKayKay for live streams and live chatting shit, and thanks in advance for watching. This video goes out to Mark, who I watched eat a Caesar salad that had boiled egg in it while I talked about my idea for this video. Thank you, Mark. So I will talk about Edith Finch soon, I promise, but I need to lay down some groundwork first. If you'd like to skip the groundwork and just want to see Edie doing her thing, skip to the timestamp on the screen. Otherwise, I'm going to talk about postmodernism. Fuck yeah. But to be clear, this is more me talking about the genre as a whole and how Edie falls into it, which means if you're looking for a thorough pick-apart of this game, you will probably be disappointed. Although I've had Joseph Anderson's video recommended to me so often that it may as well now be lumped in with the texts I get from Domino's every single day because I ordered once in October 2019 and forgot to tick the opt-out checkbox. So I reckon that'll be a good one to start with if you want to see anything of actual depth. You go, Joe. There are a few very obvious messages and hidden details in this game, but with the existence of the wider hive mind of the internet, they're available 24/7 to document and make content about every single hidden piece of information in every single game that has ever existed. It means that any and every potential message that this game could be telling us has been utterly done to death by similar videos, and to be honest with you, I'm not going to retread the same shit. So this is some new shit. So this isn't a let's play, this isn't an in-depth unpacking and review of what remains of Edith Finch, so if it doesn't sound like this is going to be your kind of thing, feel free to dip. I won't take it personally. And full spoilers ahead for what remains of Edith Finch, obviously, but in the discussion of this video I will also be very slightly spoiling a few other games, in the way of kind of letting you onto the fact that they cover similar themes. Bioshock, Spec Ops, The Line, Portal, Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice, Bioshock Infinite, Undertale, Doki Doki Literature Club, etc. If you're concerned about any of those, just skip to the on-screen timestamp. So, postmodernism is, as it happens, apparently a thing that is actually real and not a made-up word there to fluff up blurbs and New York Times reviews with a bit of extra padding. Postmodernism is essentially a genre of writing skepticism. Skepticism of existing tropes, long-established narratives and ideas, and the idea of objective fact in media. One key trait of postmodernism, for example, is the unreliable narrator. Unreliable narrators have been pretty constant facets of books, TV, film, even plays and whatever for a long time. But, you know, as the medium of gaming is still fairly new, and we only really in the last few decades hit the technical capability to be able to deliver a strong and consistent story-based game, it means that gaming has matured really quickly to kind of catch up to the storytelling ability of its contemporaries, particularly over the last decade. I mean, unreliable narrators, meta-narratives and stuff have existed in many different forms across gaming. The last decade isn't the only time that this kind of thing has happened. You know, we had a Metal Gear Solid 2 which got very meta, but that was in 2001. Eternal Darkness followed suit in 2002. But these were, like, remarkable exceptions, not necessarily the rule. They were more just, like, little ideas that people had that were kind of awesome and kind of out there before these wider ideas and these more like postmodern themes really began to take root around 2007. In fact, with games, you can kind of track it. Using 3 categories I invented myself and are definitely open to debate, we initially saw a wider sweeping of games begin to challenge their own established tropes and themes from around 2007, when games like Bioshock and Portal, both released in 2007, began to suggest that just because the characters say things to you doesn't necessarily mean they're telling the truth. What if, asked Portal, smirking at you from over the rim of his glasses, the tutorial voice was actually not lawful good? What if they weren't there to serve your every gaming need and raise you into success? What if they had alternative motives, and then you fall in weird acid for 2 hours? The concept of what if your guidance has alternative motives came to a boil in Spec Ops: The Line in 2012, when during the era of dirty grey shooters making you kill indiscriminately, Spec Ops: The Line challenged you to consider whether or not killing indiscriminately is sometimes a bad thing. Yeah, call it the contemporary War and Peace, boys, another book I've never read. In a way, with Spec Ops: The Line, you kind of became the unreliable voice of guidance for the other characters in your team who were dragged along with you. Not that you chose to behave maliciously, not that you were doing it specifically to be untrustworthy and to be evil. I mean, your character has got his own shit going on in that game, but you became the chaotic evil voice in other people's lives and in other people's experiences, leading them through an experience that they had no say in. I know. But for the gaming landscape at the time, it was revolutionary. By 2013, this was being parodied by the likes of the Stanley Parable, which very bluntly and very openly told you to disobey, to push the boundaries of your experience, and to challenge your narrator. By 2016, games like Fury and Soma were returning to Bioshock and Portal's roots, albeit a little bit less directly, but we already saw a full cycle in this message. That is 9 years for a full revolution of this wheel. The ideas cropped up, were developed, parodied, played on, and less than a decade later, we are back revisiting the same tropes, albeit with a different light to cast on them. Category-wise, I call these boys the question everything category of postmodern games. As quickly as these games started to rise, they fell. So many games started to catch on to these meta-narrative themes that this kind of tongue-in-cheek observation of blindly following instructions given to you by a random piece of software almost became a staple for games in some capacity. If your game doesn't say something about meta-narratives at this point, have you even made a game? Combine it with a cheeky fourth wall break and we're basically in Game of the Year territory. So many games now, especially story-based games, have some level of this is what your character thinks is happening, and this is what is actually happening. So in terms of these themes, they're no longer particularly really unique, and they no longer necessarily set a game apart, unless they're done to quite extreme lengths or the narrative is based around the theme itself. And as the lines begin to blur, we saw rise to our second category, everything is a lie. Beginning fairly subtly with the blink and you miss it historical revisionism of Bastion in 2011, this trope began to simmer with 2013's Bioshock Infinite, where our main character, Booker DeWitt, told us one story, either through delusion, a repressed memory, or guilt, but whatever, the game unravelled another, and by the end, the context had entirely changed, as did the light we viewed Booker in. As far as twists go, it's fairly massive. In my opinion, it's not excellent, but it's at least massive. This trope hit its stride in 2017 with Firewatch, Hellblade's Senua's Sacrifice, and What Remains of Edith Finch, all released in the same year, all a different variation on this trope. Our main characters go into the game with their own preconceptions of the world, they carry forward and specifically tell us details that they think are relevant, and by the end of the game, the reality of their situation is either completely laid bare to us and completely exposed, or we are given the tools and information we need to read between the lines competently enough that we can say that we know the reality of what's happening, even if it's not presented. Finally, we saw the real subversion of these tropes with our final category, which cropped up in the latter half of the decade. The game is more aware of you than you are of it is a category that began to pop up like daisies in 2015 with games like Undertale, which for those of you who have played it, is an extremely meta experience. And strangely, according to Tumblr, a very horny one. I don't know personally, I never beat the final boss, and I think I'm content with that. You can keep that. From here, we hit Pony Island in 2016, then the weebs had a crack at it with Doki Doki Literature Club and Nier Automata in 2017, and finally, at least according to my friend Yami, I've not verified this, Inscription brought up the rear as late as 2021. Over the last decade, every kind of 3 or 4 years, postmodern themes in gaming have moved so quickly, we can literally see it cycle over itself over and over again. What starts with one novel idea, like your tutorial voice is untrustworthy, gets picked up by a bunch of games, done to death, then we subvert it, now the character themselves is untrustworthy, and then a few years later, oh no, the game itself is untrustworthy. Every revolution of this wheel of postmodernism is all about questioning the assumptions of the previous rotation. In 2013, the Stanley Parable asked why your so fixated on following directions, what things you might be missing by listening and obeying this random tutorial voice, whether you're a chump for doing what you're told. By the time we hit Edith Finch, it's more subtle. It's no longer a tutorial voice telling you to go left when you really should be going right. It's your main character telling you a story of all the stories she's read that were written by characters that are already long dead. Everything we hear in this game is at least twice separated from us, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 times separated. Not only is she feeding you information moment to moment that you can take at face value or question, but she is a third-party source of knowledge, reading us stories written by people who in some cases were extremely young, unable to grasp the reality of their situation, or even a parent of a child who wrote after their child's death, assuming many facts about the situation itself. Some of them are written by psychologists or comic book writers, and so they take whatever assumptions they need and whatever creative liberties they want, and they add it to a growing pile of written canon about the Finch family. And, you know, obviously, before you say, all of the games I've mentioned here today aren't all walking simulators. I understand that. They are many games of many different genres, but the issue kind of highlighted here being that, you know, for example, let's take Doki Doki Literature Club. Doki Doki Literature Club is scary and novel enough that it carries with it a plethora of compelling and interesting mechanics and story choices on its own before we even get to the metafiction. Undertale is not only a fantastic bullet hell game with an interesting art style and story all on its own, but has probably one of the most expansive archives of fan-made pornography I have ever heard of. So there's plenty to dig your teeth into beyond just your basic experience with the game. Spec Ops and Bioshock obviously are first-person shooter games as well, with their own rich stories and mechanics anyway. All these games are, what, like at least 50% gameplay, 50% story, some more, some less, but it means that they get away with more when their story suffers. Moments where their story is weaker, for example, Bioshock's piss-soaked excuse for a final boss. In these moments, the experience is still held up by the gameplay itself. Walking simulators, however, don't get that luxury. They don't have things like that to fall back on. Where the story is weak, the overall experience with the game suffers exponentially. The only issue is that as we stack layers of cynical meta-narrative on top of each other over and over again, we get to a point where original ideas become stale. They're either done to death or subverted so hard by later games that the original ideas are two-dimensional. By comparison. And on return, you'll never quite be able to find what hits so hard about that original magic if you've played more developed ideas in game form since. Specifically, Spec Ops: The Line and Bioshock, in my opinion, definitely don't hit as hard nowadays as they used to. I mean, you can play them and enjoy them and have a really good time, really fun games, but in terms of the, like, twists of the game, I feel like nowadays that would come off more as a modest surprise. But back in 2007, like, those twists hit very hard. For people who had spent their entire lives having true and honest directions administered to them by tooltips and fairies and crystal dragons, the idea that your tutorial could be actively working to sabotage you was kind of a mind blower. Games would just fly into fame on that mere premise alone. Going back to play games like Bioshock and Portal well after the fact, I mean, they're good. They're definitely solid experiences, good mechanics, interesting stories, but in my humble opinion, they wouldn't be seen as the gaming giants they're seen as today if not for their perfect timing and the fact that they kind of got to it first. Not completely first, but they kind of got to it at the start of this big wave, you know what I mean? If it wasn't for the fact that they were seen to break ground in the genre of metafiction, I don't think they would have thrived as much as they did. Also, Portal 2, I think, was better than Portal 1, because I liked the bit at the end. Nowadays, unreliable narrators and tutorial voices with alternative motives have become predictable and even fairly overdone. It's no longer a surprise when a game goes, hey, you know, I'm watching you. I saw you make that assumption and I want you to know it's wrong. We've moved on to new stuff now. Even the super meta, the game is self-aware genre that Doki Doki Literature Club and Undertale absolutely raw-dogged into the forefront is, by the year of our Lord 2022, becoming a bit old news. What's next for gaming, or has postmodernism run its course? Which brings us to What Remains of Edith Finch. The premise of What Remains of Edith Finch is really interesting, and on some levels I wonder whether or not the game will affect you more or less based on not only the time you play it, but also the games you've played before. Not only the biases references you have from other games, stories done better or games of higher or lower quality produced, but also the amount of meta-narrative you've been subjected to and how tired you are of that by the time you pick up the sticks and play it for yourself, which I kind of was, so buckle up. So, what's our story? Edith Finch, our main character, spawns on a ferry looking out over the sea. I'm going to start at the beginning, with this house, she explains, telling us that her younger brother Milton disappeared when she was 4 years old, just swallowed up by a house full of rooms she couldn't go into. We start the story seeing a huge cobbled together home towering over mountains and forests and streams directly ahead, perfectly framed by the trees around it. The weather is dour. In her mother's will, Edith Finch inherited this mysterious old house and received a key, bringing her right back to her childhood home. She has questions that can only be answered by the truths inside the house, but she remarks, "As a child, the house made me uncomfortable in a way that I couldn't put into words. A normal house, but more like a smile with too many teeth," she observes, which is actually a really creepy observation to make. Nice one, Edith. She's kind of right. The house is constructed from a basic mansion, but as the family grew, they just added more and more bits and pieces to it until it resembled something from a series of unfortunate events. A big twisting lump of wood and planks to probably make one of the most dangerous homes in existence. I do wonder whether the fire escape plans for those living on the highest points of this home are anything more than pray and cry. The atmosphere is solid. The house is completely silent on arrival, and you're free to ponder about the place and rummage around as you want. You can't interact with much, but Edith will often make observations on the things you're seeing, which adds a bit of flavour to the story. As with all walking simulators, this game's mechanics are bare bones, laughably bare bones. You walk very, very slowly around the house, able to look to your heart's content at piles of books and family photos and all sorts of intricate details. One of the things I really like about this game is the level of detail. Designing not only the entire house, but every resident's individual bedroom must have taken an astronomical amount of time. Most of the books have names along the spine, carefully chosen per resident to highlight their personality. Clothes and accessories will be unique per bedroom, like Molly's cat ears and Calvin's astronaut room. Paraphernalia from their jobs and hobbies are in abundance. Barbara, the child star, has a room littered with old cardboard cutouts and movie posters. Sam, the military veteran who loves hunting, has a room full of taxidermied animals and photos from when he was on duty. There's also miles of foreshadowing. A stag will leap in front of you as you enter the house. A little froggy toy sits innocently on a bathroom sink. Gravestones are adorned with details about the deaths of family members you might not yet have seen, providing a tiny clue as to where they might be going with their own story. Each bedroom door is even unique, allowing you to peep through the peephole on each one to see a fisheye snapshot of the room inside. Although after playing months of horror games, I did it through my fingers and constantly worried that there would be a creepy Easter egg, but thankfully this isn't one of those games. What Remains of Edith Finch is probably some of the best level design I've ever seen, in part due to most of the free roam, very loosely described, sections that take place in such a tiny map, giving the team a small enough space to absolutely ram it floor to ceiling with personality. Traversing through it, despite the utterly crippled mechanics of the experience, is also very fun. In another series of unfortunate events spin, you don't just walk through doors, you take your key to a book on a windowsill and open it, finding a padlock inside that, when unlocked, allows Edith to climb through a section of wall into the next bedroom. The whole house is like this, where the conventional method of simply walking through a door is pushed aside. Edith crawls and climbs through this house like a huge climbing frame, walking through these memories as they unfold in front of her like physical manifestations of the book she's reading. The house opens up chapter by chapter in a way that flows so fluently. There's one use button, which is R2 on the PlayStation, and for those of you who are familiar with Telltale's Walking Dead, it does the thing where you move the analog stick in the direction of what you want to do, and your character takes enormous creative liberty with interpreting what you mean. So you want to look through peepholes or climb through tiny hatches in the wall? Just press forwards, Edith will do the rest. Want to close a book? Just pull back on the stick like you're trying to back away from it, and Edith has you covered. Want to open doors and secret sections in the wall? Just point at them with the stick, and Edith on screen will perform something that seems far more complex and interesting than what you yourself are doing with your hands to get her to help you out. There's a pop-up book in one of the scenes where you use the analog stick to pull sections of the pop-up book to jump out or show movement, and it's exactly how playing this game feels. The motions you do are very simple, but the on-screen response is occasionally surprisingly complex, and that dissonance kind of of bothered me, especially when replaying. I played through this game a few times to get as full as impression as I could, and even on the first playthrough, I wasn't annoyed, but more disappointed that I wasn't more challenged by this game on any level beyond just my capacity to sit and watch something for 2 hours, which makes me sound like I'm talking about a completely different medium of entertainment. A lot of this house feels like it could be a puzzle, and I was kind of hoping for an opportunity to use my head on a few occasions, but it wasn't to be. I mean, I imagine the designers just wanted to focus on the story, and I have nothing but respect for that. But it's just, this is more a personal preference nitpick thing that I'm kind of just laying out there. This is just my absolute most base possible opinion. I kind of like a little bit of meat on the bones of the games I've played. I don't expect Edith to have limited lives or patrolling monsters running around the place, and God, I repeat, I am so done with patrolling monsters that you have to sneak around. But yeah, this game is definitely a walking simulator through and through, because by God do you walk during this. The real meat of this story begins when we start to get access to the family bedrooms. See, the Finch family are a bit weird. Their house is kind of like a family graveyard, except instead of stones and corpses, there are locked doors and empty rooms, perfectly preserved, full of all the deceased's old things, but meaning that the living members of the family have to awkwardly build their own makeshift and extremely dangerous bedrooms higher and higher up on the house, which probably means it takes about 10 minutes to get from the front door to some of those bedrooms on the top floor. Imagine getting in from leg day at the gym and having to crab walk up to a fucking crow's nest. The first bedroom we find is a girl called Molly, who died aged 10, and here the game introduces us to like an unreliable narrator squared, because to learn how Molly died, we open Molly's diary that she really reliably wrote in right up until the moment she literally died, and when I say we, I mean Edith does. So Edith cracks open this book and she starts to read, and we start playing the moment of Molly's death, but as I took to mean it, we started playing it as Edith imagined it from what she was reading. So we have like a dodecahedron of unreliable narration going on. Molly grappling with what's going on in her own mind, a 10-year-old trying to put that to written words, Edith coming along about 60 years later and reading it herself, the only context being that Molly died. It is honestly incredibly effective. As I played through the game, I started to figure out that my favourite part of the game itself was just figuring what was going on and understanding what was reality and what wasn't. A lot of these deaths are told to us in very embellished ways, which I really like. There's a lot of visual metaphor, there's a lot of fancy storytelling, and it's very compelling stuff. Like, both visually and narratively, it's really interesting to pick apart what's going on screen. There's a lot of debate over some of the deaths, and with some answers being more obvious than others, still, with a lot of them, nobody is 100% sure, or could ever really say that they were 100% sure on what exactly happened. The use of, like, extra layers of unreliable narration, meaning that this game is essentially just a game of telephone, would normally probably be quite frustrating, I think. Basically telling a story you've been told by somebody else who is reading it from a record written by somebody else who saw it and may not still have had the full picture of what was going on. Accidentally mistranslating and misunderstanding things. I mean, it's pretty cool. In some stories, I think it would have really got on my nerves, but in this game, it really works. And in my opinion, it forms the crux on why this game, at its core, has like a really compelling premise. I quite happily played the game in the shoes of some kind of amateur private investigator, trying to unwind all these stories and figure out, you know, what exactly has happened in this house. Because although Molly describes being so hungry that she ate her gerbil's poopy food, an entire tube of fluoride toothpaste, which is actually really dangerous, like, Google it. It's actually insanely dangerous to do that. And then ate some random strange berries off the window and then immediately turned into a cat. We know in reality that she ate poisonous food and died a horrible, confused death in her bed. Life cut short by a tragic 10 years. You know, we're not dumb. I found myself frustrated by the lack of any real answers that this game would give me, even hidden deep into the bones of the house. I know that this is a game about mystery and pitfalls of putting meaning to coincidence and accidents, and to search for answers is kind of counterproductive, but it would have been cool to have been rewarded for really scouring the game and really putting all the pieces together. But at the same time, I understand the logic and I don't see it as an error of the game, more just like an unfulfilled clue that I would have loved to see see explored personally. So here's the thing. The premise of this game I think is fairly obvious, but I do think it's more or less obvious depending on whether or not you know what you're looking for. If you've not played many games with unreliable narrators or untrustworthy sources of information, you might find yourself really swept away in the visual metaphors. But for me, the second I saw Molly eating a boatload of poison and then turning into a cat, I was like, oh yeah, no, okay, this is a game about neglect. Hooray for me, because stuff so often flies right over my head. I am a very literal taker of cues. And for me, I think knowing that from the start really affected the way that I played the game. I mean, I walked into situations with a feeling of dirty cynicism. Like, it felt wrong and sordid to be feeling the way I felt. Like, I just immediately had a prejudice that meant I could no longer be swept away with the fun of the story, enjoy it completely at face value, consider this curse and what caused it, and only after finishing the game, stepping back and reflecting, letting the cogs in my mind turn as the story slowly settled down, and then came to my own conclusions and interpretations of the wider story. That was kind of stolen from me. I was essentially locked in to the twist from moment one, and weirdly I felt a lot of FOMO when I would later see people say it took a while for them to realise what exactly was going on and understand the reality of the situation. I also wanted to enjoy a brief period of romanticised ignorance, you know? It's like taking a nice warm bath, except the water is lies. See, this game is essentially based all around a family curse, something Edie, Edith's grandma, insists was carried over with them when the family emigrated from Norway, bringing their entire house with them in the process, which is definitely some kind of metaphor for inherited baggage. The original house is knocked into the sea just before they arrive, killing Odin, the head of the family, and still sits there on the sea floor, the top of the house just peeking out over the waves, visible from many different points of the game. Again, probably a metaphor. The family curse is a concept that we're introduced very early on with. I think it's basically almost straight after Molly dies that we get told about it. It might be a little bit later. And as we walk through this weird mausoleum of children's toys, we find a series of rooms of people who have died that, depending on how quickly you realise, died definitely due to the consequences of parental negligence. Calvin, a little boy who loved space, enjoys his final moments on a swing set overlooking a jagged picket fence and a set of sheer cliffs. I wonder how that goes down. After his death, his twin brother is forced to continue to share a room with dead Calvin's memory and all of his preserved belongings, which I can only imagine was emotionally torturous enough to be the exact and only reason why he enlisted with the military as soon as he was physically able to, and then fled the house. After Molly's death scene, I stepped out of the roof and looked down to check Edith's footing, anxious that she might fall, even though, like, this game absolutely would not allow that, and I noticed that she was also quite pregnant. Edith does acknowledge it at around the halfway point of the story, maybe about 2/3 in, I can't remember, but this is one of the details I noticed so early on that it kind of changed my experience with the game to be more of an aware one. It's so weird, this is gonna sound ridiculous, but I felt like I'd been spoiled by the game itself. Like, I noticed it and I was like, oh god, no, now I know, you know? It was a really weirdly frustrating moment. The game told me exactly what I need when I needed to see it. I'm very sure that the writers included these details so that we could notice it as we played. And for some reason, I know this is the stupidest thing that I've ever said, but weirdly, I felt bitter that I noticed these details early on, because it meant that I could no longer approach the game with a kind of childish sense of wonder. I couldn't just sit and watch and consume. I had to now look at the game with like a mature adult perspective and recognize the issues where people weren't taking responsibility and be like, oh yeah, that was really negligent of that parent to do that. You know, I couldn't just sit and just enjoy this fantastical level of discovery and, you know, have this face value enjoyment. I was just, you know, I was in my big boy shoes and I was like, that's a safety hazard. Why have you sent her to bed with that dinner? Why have you left that baby in the bath? I never said I was good at writing about games, but you guys watched the videos. So Barbara, a tragic child actor who Hollywood used up and cast aside, is trying to claw her way back into acting, her passion, and gets a gig at a local convention. She's practicing her act with her boyfriend when her dad is suddenly rushed to hospital, having gotten his hand caught in a saw blade, leaving Barbara stuck at home with her brother Walter, missing her opportunity of a lifetime. Barbara's story is told to us in a kind of cruelly written and oddly spiteful comic made about her by someone who was told about her death by an undisclosed member of the family, presumably Edie, Edie, since family secrets are shared in that comic. So again, we have several degrees of separation. Just to make absolutely sure you know for sure that it's unreliable, the narrator towards the end of this story goes, "I wasn't there myself." Like, yes, game, yes, I understand. Thanks. You don't need to spell it out so hard. Nothing is left of Barbara except for her ear inside a music box that the family then kept forever, and you yourself actually used to get a key for the basement, which is pretty nuts. The more I played this game, the more it just felt like a straight up horror. Like that thing would have been thrown into the sea if I was Barbara's grieving parents. Edith works her way into the basement, finding a bunker under the house that Barbara's traumatized younger brother Walter lived in until his death about 30 years later, eating these gross peaches that look like egg yolks, too scared to leave. None of us has gotten very far, Edith comments, and for the death of Edith's grandfather, Grandpa Sam, Calvin's brother who enlisted, we learned the story through a set of developed photographs that, hilariously, Dawn did not throw away as soon as she realised the literal moment of her dad's death had been captured on film. My god, these people. The next scene is told to us through the note on the back of a divorce paper. That one is very hard to watch. One of them is told to us through a poem. One story is told via a letter from a psychiatrist that was treating a member of the family. Almost every story in this game sits at least 2 degrees of separation from us. And there's also a bit where we're in a coochie. Nothing remarkable to note there, just wanted to get it out there. It was very intimately weird. There's a lot about this story that I really like, just on a fundamental level, and especially since there are details that embellish the story on future playthroughs. It's quite a creepy story, all things considered. I think by the time I came around to my second playthrough, I was seeing it more as a strange thriller type thing. But the first playthrough, I just kind of spent the whole time confused. There's a lot to be said for Edie's involvement in this death. That's Edith's grandma, not Edith herself. I don't know if she benefited financially in any way from having, like, the famous family that all die young. If she sold the story to that comic book writer, then maybe on some level she's earning money from this. But maybe it's just the prestige of having, like, a famous cursed family. But there's a lot of evidence that she pushes this myth for the sake of her own fame and her own material gain, and whatever it is she feels that she gets out of it. Supporting Walter in shutting himself away below ground for his entire remaining lifespan, besides about 5 minutes, potentially selling Barbara's story, staunchly insisting that her husband was killed by a dragon, when in reality a dragon-shaped waterslide fell on his head. There's a lot to interpret about Edie's behaviour too, and the game goes to great lengths to demonstrate how she others death, using the curse as something she can displace responsibility or parental neglect onto, but also gives her a kind of weird aura of invincibility when faced with criticism. She won't be moved and she won't be criticised because she and her family have a curse, which means that they are special. The family has a weird dichotomy where they are simultaneously terrified of fate and also simultaneously completely embrace it. Like, they accept the inevitability of the curse to the point where they are willfully negligent of themselves and their families. Even Edith, fairly pregnant, is bouncing around on cliff edges and rooftops as though she is 100% safe because she will be taken exactly when the curse wants to take her. She has a very strange but unshakable faith in this almost Final Destination style end she seems to think she will eventually find, but not here and not now. "I wish I had thought about you that day, but I didn't until we found you," says a poem written by Dawn, Edith's mother, when dealing with the death of her brother Gus, and it's definitely emblematic of the whole issue. The family do not think. At all. But at the same time, they hide away in this house and never stray too far. It's shown best by Walter, who just sat in a bunker for 30 years. If you pull the curtains of the bunker, you will see a painting of the outside, like a fake window. And I think it's a perfect representation of the family's attitude. The music box that held Barbara's ear is still there, the frog we see during Gregory's scene in the bath is still on the sink, the dragon that fell on Sven and killed him. The house is like a mausoleum of perfectly preserved death and trauma. Like if somebody you love died in a car accident and you bought the car, like the actual car, and put it in your garden as a strange water feature. That's kind of what this house is like, but times 16. I don't know if it was because the family was so accepting of their inevitable death that they just took this careless attitude towards said instruments of death that killed them, or if they were just so delusionally negligent that the things that killed their family, the boat, the bath, the music box, are just completely separate in their mind from the curse. You know, like how Batman doesn't kill people by throwing them off buildings, he throws them off buildings and then gravity kills them. Like, do the Finches see these instruments of death as Batman or gravity? Because I feel like the house is full of Batman and the curse is to them gravity, and they just separate it in their minds completely. As Edith passes the halfway point of the game, she starts to loudly verbalize a lot of this. She says, maybe we believed so much in a family curse that we made it real, which on some levels is a valid thing for her to wonder, I suppose, but on another level, I felt like the writers were hanging over my shoulder like, are you sure you know this is unreliable? Are you sure? Let us remind you that these are a series of unreliable narrators. Like, I have no proof and I absolutely don't care enough to check, but it felt very helicopter parenty, ironically. Like, the game was so scared that I would relax and enjoy it at face value, when in actuality, it was going way too far to make sure I understood completely that Edith and her family are as unreliable as they can get. The burden of walking simulators is that, ironically, they will always be walked over. That is their curse, again, ironically. They present new ideas and new tropes, subvert old ones, and make observations about our daily lives and assumptions. This game is kind of all about how we put too much stock into curses, we romanticize death, and issues that can often come down to like blunter problems such as negligence. What we're told isn't always what happens. Yeah, you know, genius, well done. It's been done elsewhere, in some ways better and in some ways worse, but it has been done elsewhere, in different ways, shining different lights on different similar situations. And then the next wave of meta-narrative comes along, retreads it but slightly more meta, makes observations on the observations, adds a layer of sophistication and refinement to these existing ideas, and those original games are suddenly old. BioShock's a great game, yeah, but it won't hit the same level if you've played any of the deluge that came since. The same will go for What Remains of Edith Finch. The only difference between the two games is that BioShock spreads its playability over several different fronts. The gameplay is as in-depth as a 6-hour FPS can be. It has a surprisingly thorough combat system that means different approaches can be taken on each replay. The story features not only this untrustworthy voice, but also a rich set of branching stories focusing on all aspects of the setting and characters. The story of BioShock is not the be-all and end-all of the game's enjoyability, replayability, and viability. Whereas with What Remains of Edith Finch, it banks itself and its success entirely on one completely unflinching story that cannot be approached nor played in any other way, merely replayed for like diminishing returns on the details that you notice each time, but you'll never have a new experience with this game. And like I said in the introduction, that is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying that that is a bad thing. We can have a solid 2-hour experience. That is what films are for. People who are disappointed that games like Cult of the Lamb are only 20 hours long are the same people who will be arbitrarily disappointed that What Remains of Edith Finch doesn't have an elaborate magic system and a New Game Plus cycle. Despite what I am kind of discussing, I am not a part of that dribbling band of idiots, I swear. I think often a 2-hour experience can be more memorable than a 200-hour experience. I can remember a higher proportion of Edith's story than I can remember about The Witcher 3 in its entirety. But I would much prefer to play The Witcher 3. I just think that Edith Finch's story is a bit more compelling and much more memorable. I think Edith Finch's story is one that will carry with me longer, and I guess that's because the two games aim to achieve completely different goals in a way, where The Witcher 3 is more about gameplay and partially about story. Edith Finch banks itself entirely on the story it tells. It's kind of a different direction that it takes. Nothing in The Witcher 3 will stick with me like Gregory's scene in the bath, a story that I really, really hate playing every single time I replay it, and I just couldn't discuss it here. For reasons you might understand yourself if you've played it, like it's a really hard section to play. But I can't help but wonder which games will take What Remains of Edith Finch and do it better in the future, as the wheel of meta-narration keeps rolling forwards, raising new tropes and subverting old ones. Because soon enough there will be something to rival this game. It might do it appallingly and it might not, but in such a fast-paced atmosphere as this particular genre of gaming tends to be, it is as inevitable as the Finch family curse, and perhaps just as futile. Ultimately, I think What Remains of Edith Finch is an absurdly subjective experience to anyone who plays it. Some of my friends thought it was some of the most self-important shit they'd ever played. Some of my friends think it's God's gift to man. I think the game is alright, and I think that's in part due to my existing cynicism with meta-narrative. The second I saw that berry scene, I knew exactly what was going on. And while some sharper players would notice that regardless of games that they've played in the past, my current overwhelming interest in games with unreliable narrators meant that I was so well prepared for it that I saw it, clocked it, and in a way that immediate recognition spoiled the experience for me, by my own standards. But only somewhat. See, the saving grace of What Remains of Edith Finch, and what I think kind of more generally helped it, is that it doesn't solely rely on the trope of the unreliable narrator. It doesn't completely bank its success on you're being shown something, but it's actually something else. Like, Yeah, it doesn't take a genius to realise Calvin didn't go flying away. He probably flew off the swing and fell down the cliffs, you know? And the second you overcome that realisation is the second that the fantasy zeal of this game is kind of lost. Yeah, the curse allows the family to shift responsibility for death. We definitely get it. Rather, I think this game benefits from having greater meaning, namely deifying and othering the curse of death. Trying to run from the inevitability rather than band together and enjoy every day meant that many members of the Finch family ultimately not only died before their time, but also suffered incomplete, terrified lives, holed up in bunkers and suffering the failures of their marriages and never quite stepping foot into the outside world. Sure, the meta-narrative of this is shown to us by the parental negligence, this failure of the older members of the family to properly supervise or teach their children, but that's old news by this point. Once upon a time, that was a clickbait twist on a YouTube thumbnail, whereas nowadays it's probably something you'd know well before you even tried the game, because it has been done before, and it will be done again. Thanks for watching my examination of the burden of walking simulators, the trends of meta-narratives across the last decade, and my analysis on whether or not they were even remotely successful in What Remains of Edith Finch, as well as a general review of the game as a whole. This one was a really wide subject to tackle, but it's one that I've wanted to talk about for ages, so I thought that I would take the chance now. If you enjoyed the video, consider dropping me a like and subscribing here on YouTube. We talk about all sorts of stuff here, mainly games, but occasionally other media, and if that sounds like something you would enjoy, stick around for more. Also, drop a comment. What's your favourite meta-narrative game? Favourite unreliable narrator? Were you convinced by Edith Finch, or did you know there was something fishy from the start? Finally, remember to check out my Patreon if you're interested in those 5-minute reviews. The first 3 will be on Hades, Cuphead, and Grease, and I'll be covering games that I want to talk about but don't want to make long-form content on, which just adds the challenge of squeezing everything I want to discuss into 5 minutes instead. Those are available to all Patreon tiers regardless of cost, so check them out when you get a moment. Beyond that, have a great week everybody, and I will see you in the next video.